Hello again, everyone, and welcome back to Reddit Aliens. I'm John, and as always, thank you so much for being here. Good topic for you today. Let's do it. What's an instance in your life that you felt the most intense fear? Please remember to like, share, and subscribe. True story. It was a few years ago when I was working late at my old job as a sysadmin. I was doing some updates to the firewall VPN and had to do this after hours. The building I worked in was rather small. It had about 5 small offices, including mine. It's around 9 p.m. and all the lights are off in the building. I'm hacking away at my keyboard when I notice 2 glowing red orbs floating in my doorway. I'm petrified, horrifically petrified. These orbs are just sort of bobbing and menacingly approaching me slowly. They get brighter and closer and seemingly stare into my soul as I sit there behind my desk, telling myself to get up and do something, anything. In a bold move, I jump back from my chair and let out a shriek. The orbs still there floating, now just a few feet from my desk. I make a break for the light switch and prepare to face whatever demonic presence has taken over my office. Lo and behold, the terror of the night was little more than a helium-filled happy birthday foil balloon. The shiny side was facing my desk, reflecting the infernal glow of the red LEDs on my docking station. The air conditioner intake vent had pulled the balloon from a coworker office to mine. I'd conquered the most terrifying moment of my life, and instead of feeling accomplished, I felt absolutely moronic. I never told any of my coworkers. I was living with a roommate in a seedy part of Nashville in a crappy little dive apartment. My room was the last door on the left, and my roommate's room was just before mine. I woke up at about 3 a.m. when I suddenly realized that the light was on. My room door was also open, even though I always slept with it shut. I was mostly just disoriented at first, but I knew something was wrong, so I grabbed my cell phone and peeked out into the hallway. There was a strange man standing in the doorway looking toward the kitchen. I couldn't hear any sounds coming from my roommate's room. My heart was in my throat, and I ran into my closet, which was a pass-through between my room and the bathroom. I locked myself in from both sides and called 911. I could barely hear the dispatcher over the sound of my heartbeat hammering in my ears. The 10 minutes I spent huddled on the floor of my closet, brandishing a wooden bed riser like a baseball bat, wondering if my roommate was alive, while the 911 dispatcher told me how calm I sounded, were the worst 10 minutes of my life. The police did eventually show up. My roommate was fine, she slept through the whole thing, and we got most of our stuff back. He dumped a lot of it while running from the cops, but I'll never forget how vulnerable and helpless I felt. I grew up in Kenya and was there for the coup d'etat in 1982. Unfortunately for me, I had an infection on my ankle that had been getting bad in the days preceding the coup. On the night things blew up, I took a turn for the worse. I was developing septicemia, but as there was mortar and machine gun fire in the area, we had to wait. In the morning, we learned of the 24-hour curfew, with only emergency travel allowed. My mother and stepfather had decided the best thing to do was to have our driver take me to the doctor. Back then, you didn't go to the hospital unless you were actively dying or wanted to be. I was upset and didn't understand at the time why I was going alone with him, but learned later it was to have someone fluent in Swahili in the car, and more important, to minimize family casualties if our car was shot en route. I was very weak by the time we left and was carried to the car. I was told to hold my passport out the window when we approached any roadblocks. I remember dozing off and on for the 40-minute ride to the first major roundabout at Muthaiga, which was where all the diplomats lived and had seen a lot of fighting. We had heard over the radio that a woman, a German diplomat's wife, had been killed here when a mortar landed on her. As we approached, Andrew, our driver, roused me by sharply demanding that I get my passport out of the window. I began to protest, but at his reaction opened my eyes to see about 4 soldiers with their guns trained on our car, yelling at us. The scene was chaotic, frantic and frightening. Cars, whose occupants had been shot, were in the road and alongside it, crashed into light poles or half in the hedges, with blood on the windshields and the doors. Some still had bodies in them. The soldiers were scared themselves and fierce. Holding our breath, we advanced as instructed on the block, holding our passport and his ID card out of the window. While we were picking our way around the cars, strewn on the road to pass, the next car in line with no other before us, someone started shooting immediately. All of these agitated, scared shoulders crouched down and trained their weapons randomly on anything that moved. Apart from the gunfire, it was horribly quiet. They were all confused as to who had shot at what, and whether they needed to shoot at something else. Andrew and I hid on the floor of the car. I could barely reach to keep my passport up. I don't know how long we were waiting there, but it can't have been long as I felt it. I was young, sick, and scared, so it felt like hours before we were moving again. Luckily, Nairobi had been routed of the rebels, in this case, the Navy and university students, and was not as trigger-happy. Though evidence of that area's battle were plain, 3 buses filled with students bent over, toppling Danielle Arap Moi, had been gunned down on the Uhuru Highway, Freedom Highway. My wife had just recently had minor back surgery and was taking several pain-relieving medications and muscle relaxers. She would take this combo before bed to help sleep, and it worked really, really well. One evening, she dozed off and says she wants to take a quick hot bath to relax for a few minutes before heading off to bed. She fills the tub, and I head to the living room to watch some television with my mother, who's visiting us. I tell my wife to let me know when she's done with her bath and I'll come back and tuck her in. Instead of watching television, I mess around with the kiddo and chat with my mom, which causes me to lose track of time. Almost an hour goes by and I realize that my wife never came to get tucked in. I pass the tyke off to Mom and head to the bedroom to see if she went to bed. When I get to the bedroom, all the lights are on and the bed is made. With a small I head toward the master bath. The door is closed, so I give a small knock and ask if I can come in. After a few moments with no reply, I open the door. What I find is my wife lying face down in the tub, her arms down at her side, and she slid down so that her knees are bent and her feet are against the tiles on the wall. The water in the tub is so still, her hair isn't even moving. She doesn't move at all when I come into the bathroom. The next fraction of a second was without a doubt the longest of my life. In that tiniest space of time, I imagined and recorded in my brain volumes of actions from what I imagined it was going to be like to reach into what was certainly now cold water in the tub, to how I was going to try and explain to our someday teenage daughter just how much her mother loved her. All this had transpired in just a flash. Before the bathroom door was even halfway open, I had taken in the scene and prepared my response. With a lightning bolt of adrenaline, I flung the bathroom door the rest of the way open and leapt to the tub. As my arm shot down, I yelled my wife's name in a short, loud report and grabbed her by the shoulders. As I prepared to wrench her from the tub with all my strength, a few small realizations began to flash on the periphery of my now deranged senses. The water was hot, not cold. My wife seemed to be moving on her own as I began to pull on her, and there was the noise. She was most definitely screaming bloody murder as she exploded up out of the tub. My wife had been enjoying her bath so much that she decided to refill the bath with hot water. After sitting up in the bath for almost an hour, her back was a little sore, so she had rolled over to stretch it out. She had put her head under the water and was just relaxing for a few seconds before calling it a night and turning in, which just so happened to be right when I walked in and negated her hour of relaxation by scaring the holy horseshit out of her by grabbing her and barking her name at the top of my lungs. Whoops. Well, if I knew that my wife or someone I loved was taking a bath and, taking a medicine that could cause drowsiness or sleepiness, and more time passes than you think with no communication, and you see someone laying in a bathtub, you're going to freak out. So I don't think you overreacted based on the circumstance. I would hope somebody would do the same for me. But I could feel how that would cause that level of instant fear and adrenaline. So glad everything worked out. This was last summer. I had just driven overnight and arrived home so that I could leave and help my wife at an event called the Sunday Market, where she was selling artwork and some vintage clothing and whatnot. It was boiling hot outside and humid as fucking hell. So I chased my son around there until we finally got home to where I would be able to shower and finally get some sleep. We all hopped in the shower and then laid in bed fully naked and happy to be in the AC and under a fan. Just as we all started falling asleep, we are startled by what sounds like a hot air balloon going off in my basement. "What the f*** is that?" my wife asks. "Gas leak. We gotta get out here right now," I say, jumping up buck naked, grabbing my son and running full force out the front door, only grabbing a pair of boxers on the way out. Legit. 4 seconds I was up, grabbed my son and outside, putting on my boxers on a bright, sun, shiny day in my front yard. I was screaming at the top of my lungs for my wife to come now. She was inside putting on a dress because she didn't want to run out naked. I was infuriated when she finally ran out as I was running down the block. I've seen internet pictures of exploded houses because of gas leaks. The whole neighborhood is outside looking, calling the cops. Someone drives by, stops my wife, and asks if I'm stealing our baby. She explains the house is filling up with gas and they just drive off. Well, if you've come this far, you're probably thinking, why does this guy think his house is going to explode because of a gas leak? And the answer is, because I wasn't thinking, and I just woken up on zero sleep, and I smelled a gas smell and heard what I heard. It wasn't a gas leak. A propane tank was exploding in my backyard, where a hose had melted through and effectively became a flamethrower, inflated tube man, wacky wavy arm man, and was shooting huge fire lines through the air back there, which is why it sounded like a hot air balloon. Firemen got there and got it all out within minutes. But in my life, I've never, ever been more scared. I thought my wife, son, and myself were going to be evaporated in a gas explosion. I still get weak in my knees when I think about it. Woke up after a night of drinking. My brother was in my room. He didn't live with me at the time, and I said, "What's up?" He told me he was looking for a tie. I fell back asleep. 30 minutes later, my mom comes in and says, "Your brother isn't answering his phone." I immediately woke up and looked for my gun. You see, my brother had been battling depression for a few years, and somehow I just knew he had taken my firearm. I couldn't find it. I told my folks it was gone, and my dad and I started driving around and looking for him, going to his old haunts, visiting friends he still had in town. We drive back home after an hour of searching and frantically calling his phone. We pulled into our driveway at the same time. 2 police officers did. Worst day of my life. Edit. Thank you everyone for your kind words. Please, if you're thinking about suicide, please don't. PM me. Talk to someone. Do something. Anything other than that. It happened 7 years ago and it still hurts just as much now as it did then. There isn't a single day that passes without thinking of him. Every major life event, every hug I give my friends, every beer I drink, every damn thing is a reminder that someone I love more than anything isn't here anymore. As shitty as life can be, as horribly painful and confusing, it's still a wonderful thing to be alive. A few months ago in Brooklyn, there was a serial robber who attacked people with a hammer in a subway station. I was one of the victims and didn't know at the time there was more than one incident. It's a Sunday morning, and I walk into my regular subway station like clockwork at 11 a.m. It's completely empty, but I think nothing of it. My Metro card needs refilling, and I go to a machine to do so. Suddenly my vision goes white, and I'm in a daze on the floor. My head is pounding, and I realize I've been struck from behind with something. Standing above me is a tall man holding a silver hammer, looking at me with the beadiest eyes I've ever seen, and his head slightly cocked. He tells me, "Give me your wallet or I'll beat you," and begins to start swinging at me while I'm on my back. I'm screaming for help as I'm flailing my legs to fend him off. He's standing over me while swinging his hammer. I don't think there was any emotion showing on his face. I managed to block most of his hits with my kicking, but he still gets a few good whacks along my body. Finally, after a few more moments of sheer terror, I fish out my wallet and throw it his way. He scoops it up and bolts up the exit stairs. I try to pursue, but when I get above ground, he's disappeared completely. If I wasn't wearing a black beanie for work, I would have had a skull fracture or a concussion at least. It absorbed most of the initial blow, but I still bled quite a bit into the fabric, and that side of my head swelled up for a few days. Ended up getting a paid sick leave for the incident. Turns out I wasn't the first one attacked by this guy. He first assaulted a pregnant woman in Queens with a hammer and snatched her purse. A few days after my incident, another guy was struck from behind and robbed in the same station. In an ironic twist of fate, the robber's name is Anthony Coward. I was 19 years old, hanging out at a friend's apartment in a very seedy part of town. His roommate was our pot dealer and a decent guy, so we often gathered there to chill, smoke, and watch movies. The roommate left to meet his friends at a bar. We weren't of legal age yet, so we stayed behind. About 15 minutes after he left, there was a knock at the door. My friend gets up to answer the door, and suddenly 2 men armed with guns forced their way in. They showed the guns in our faces and demanded to know where the drugs and money were. I kept saying, dude, I don't know. I really don't know. I'm just a spectator. They shoved us into a back bedroom and told us to face the wall and get on our knees. We did. I felt the steel press against the back of my head. I was certain I was going to die. I couldn't think. I couldn't breathe. Time stood completely still as I closed my eyes and waited for my life to end in this shitty apartment. Then, from another bedroom down the hall, the other guy shouts, "Yo, I got it." And just as quick as they entered, they ran off into the night with some drugs and cash. The whole ordeal took less than 5 minutes. 5 agonizing minutes. My friend and I were in shock, unsure if they'd come back to finish the job. Finally, we called the roommate, and he rushed back from the bar. He kept running up the stairs with a loaded shotgun, shouting, "Where'd they go? What'd they look like?" We had no idea. We were too scared to follow them or go after them unarmed. I wasn't about to get shot over someone else's money. We obviously couldn't call the cops, and the incident went unreported. My friend moved out a few weeks later, and we haven't been back there since. The roommate, last I heard, was locked up in state prison for trafficking. I was 14 years old and with my Boy Scout troop. We were kayaking on the Susquehanna River to prepare for a sea kayaking trip. Another boy and I were the wrong path of the river. The water was very high, and we missed the huge rock sticking above the water. He went first and was fine. My kayak bumped his, sending me in broadside. My kayak flipped over, and the hydraulic sucked me underneath the water. I couldn't see or breathe. I was constantly being beaten against the rocks and spinning. I don't know how long I was under, but my lungs felt like they were on fire. I felt a feeling of blacking out. I'm not sure what happened next. I just remembered being pulled by another kayak to the bank of the river. I thought I was as good as dead. I've had a friend who has died this way before, which is what filled me with such great fear. The night my mother's ex-boyfriend tried to kill her, me, and my 2 siblings, and really almost did. He was a very physically powerful type of person, I should say. One of those guys who gets locked up a lot and just comes out more buffed out and angrier. Anyway, he had been threatening us for a year. After she dumped him, he said that he would kill her, us, and then save himself for last. My mother went to the police and went into hiding. My grandparents took all 3 of us, the kids, to Michigan, and we stayed in an apartment for a few months there. Funnily enough, despite the fact that I was separated from my mother and vaguely understood that we were in mortal danger, these were some of the happiest times of my childhood. I made some good friends that summer, stayed outside all day in the huge park, stayed up late watching VHS tapes and the occasional new DVD, and eating ice cream. For whatever reason, the police hadn't really done anything about the threats. I loved Michigan, but was eager to get back to my real school and see my mother again. The ex-boyfriend hadn't made any threats in a while, so we all felt like the heat was off. We called his bluff, and we returned just before school started back up. I don't remember the exact circumstances of how it all happened, but one night, he was at the door. Apparently, he and my mother had been talking things over because she let him in. Oof. My grandma was the only other adult there. Within a few moments, my mom and her ex are arguing over an appliance. It gets really loud and ugly, and they're throwing things, and he's punching a hole in the wall. She threatens to call the police, and he loses it. He knocks her down and starts choking the life out of her with his hands, yelling, "Call the police, bitch! Call the police!" Me and my brothers or pick up random shit and hitting him with it. We scream all types of shit. Get off our mother, let her go, etc. We were 3, 4, and 6. It was like throwing popcorn at a battleship. From where I'm swinging at him, I can see right into my mother's eyes. She can't breathe or speak at this point, and she's only struggling a little. It tears me up a little even now to think this could have been my last image of her. My grandmother is old and in very bad shape, so she pulls me off him and tells me to bring her a knife. She's real quiet about it. I'm halfway to the kitchen when my mother stumbles past me and jumps into the bathroom, hiding behind the shower curtain. He's following, but must assume that she left through the open back door, and so he leaves. We lock the doors, we gather in the living room, we cry, partly out of horror, but actually mostly because we're happy to be alive. I don't know how Mother escaped his clutches, or if he simply decided to let go. We've never even really talked about it. The youngest ones don't quite remember, and it's not something I'll bring up. I'd hate to make her relive that. In either case, I'm not even sure he ever went to prison for that in particular. He's been locked up a lot since then, but I don't know if that's one of them. We actually saw him regularly many years later. He and my mother never resumed dating, but he is the father of the youngest boy. Ugh. I can only dream of what kind of turnaround he apparently had, but she came to trust him enough to see his son eventually. Oof, I never did. And I was right. Currently I'm 18, and his kid, my brother, is 15. He's awaiting life imprisonment for murdering 2 people a couple of years ago, a man and a woman. One positive thing I got out of this was weightlifting. I never want to feel so weak and helpless again, if I can help it. A few years ago, I was in Prague with a couple of my friends. We were backpacking across Eastern Europe, and Prague was the second stop. It had been a long train ride in from Amsterdam, so we went out to start celebrating quite early. I, in particular, probably went a little too fast. By 10 p.m. I was quite drunk, and the constant smoking amplified my feels for the day. There was also a few shots of absinthe that were taken. There's always a debate whether they make you hallucinate or not, but there's no debate that they make you shit-faced drunk. The next few parts of the night are still a blur, but somehow I left my friends and found myself walking around on the street outside the bar they had been in. Something happened. Rather, I probably did something that started an altercation of sorts with a random stranger. We were able to mesh it quite peacefully, but not after some loud noises and causing quite a scene. I decided to walk away to kind of just get away from the area in case any trouble arrived. I was walking down a quiet side alley that I remembered from earlier in the day leading to my hotel, when an unmarked white van creeped past me. Now mind you, my friends and I had idiotically just watched all 2 of the Hostel movies before we had left for Europe, so that whole kidnapping thing was still fresh in my mind. I started walking faster and faster, almost came to a running pace when I thought I was just overreacting, and that the van was long gone. Less than a few seconds later, I hear brakes screeching behind me, and turn to see 3 large guys running toward me, and the same white van parked right behind them. They grabbed me and threw me inside the van before I even knew what was up. I was completely shit scared at this point and tried to reason with the 4 guys in the van, but they didn't speak a lick of English, or at least didn't respond to my pleas. We drove a few blocks until we came to a stoplight, and I decided that this was my last chance to make a break for it, or else I was completely... I dove over one of the guys sitting next to me and straight out the van door that I somehow managed to open fairly quickly. I got maybe half a block before the guy caught up to me and tackled me. I looked around and tried to scream to any onlookers to help, but of course, there was no one around to be seen. They handcuffed me in the van the rest of the way. We got to some building, very old, and the hallways we walked in looked old and dilapidated. I was still freaking out too much to think sanely or getting any real bearing of the place. They tried talking to me for a bit, but I couldn't make out the few English words they said to me. So they took me to a prison cell-esque room and started tying me down on a bed. There was blood on the headrest of the bed, and this was the moment I started realizing that something really bad was going to happen to me from that point on. They left to go do something for a few minutes, and in these few minutes, it was life or death time for me. Still to this day, I look back at those few minutes and really admire myself and what I tried to do. You always think that when you're in a life or death situation, you will fight to survive any which way you can, but you don't really know how until you're actually in one. I started trying to take off the straps immediately. There were 2 of them on my wrists and 2 around my ankles. I kicked and wiggled and did everything that was humanly possible to get out of those leather shackles. I was able to get off the 2 feet shackles within a few minutes and started focusing everything I had on my wrists. I've never fought harder to do anything in my entire life. I was fully convinced that in a few minutes I would be dead if I didn't get this done right at this moment. Somehow I was able to get the shackles off my wrists while skinning them in the process. I had blood pouring out of cuts from both my wrists and ankles, but I was free of them. I went over to the window and punched right through it, but to my utter dismay, there were bars right behind it. There was nothing I could do. I was completely trapped, but no chance of escape. My captors heard the commotion and came running into the room. They grabbed me and tied me down to the bed again, and this time put 1 strap over my chest, leaving me effectively unable to wiggle or move. This was it. I was effing done for. In the next few moments, I made peace with death for the first time in my life. A beautiful wave of peace washed through my entire body, and I laid in my bed feeling completely okay with the world. I thought about my parents and my friends and hoped that they would at least learn of my death and not left wondering what happened to me. I thought about my dog and hoped that she wouldn't think I just abandoned her. I thought about quite a few things, but all with a peaceful heart. An hour, or what felt like an hour, passed and no one came. I thought for sure they would begin skinning me alive by this point, or whatever sick torture device they would have chosen for me. This was also around the time I started getting sober, and that damn absinthe started leaving my mind. A few things I had previously been oblivious to started coming into focus. The place I was in wasn't as dilapidated and abandoned as I had previously thought. I could hear noises of people coming from down the hallway, and it reminded me of a public place, not a dilapidated kill house that I had convinced myself I was in. The street outside my now broken window also seemed quite alive. It was around this time that 2 of my captors decided to come into my room again, and I started realizing that they weren't going to kill me. They come into my room wearing raggedy-looking lab coats, but on these coats were also name tags. The next few minutes, everything started making a little sense. They gave me a breathalyzer, cleaned up my cuts, and bandaged them. Afterwards, they took me out to a waiting room with quite a few people in it, gave me my clothes back as well as a nice ticket for public intoxication, and a hefty bill for my stay. A couple things I've learned from my first stay in Prague prison hospital. I'm never drinking absinthe ever again. I'm never watching movies that scared the crap out of me before a vacation, and that I'm pretty sure that if and when I was in an actual life or death situation, I will have the will to fight for my survival. That was my most up night ever, and the strongest instance of fear I've ever felt. I was probably 13, maybe 14, waiting at the bus stop down the street. I was waiting and looking around since I didn't really talk to any of the other kids who lived in my neighborhood, and so I saw this little kid, probably no more than 2 or 3 years old, walking across its driveway in a onesie. Obviously, I thought it was odd that a kid so young would be by itself, let alone so early in the morning, but I kind of assumed its parents would just come out in the car or leave for work in a minute or something like that. Anyways, they didn't. The kid was just out there, and a bus was approaching just as this little girl was crossing the street. She had no idea, obviously, that she could be hurt at all, and I just stood there with my mouth wide open, unable to even get a sound out, even though I knew I was the only one who saw her. The bus was coming and not stopping. I was just walking closer and closer to the spot, but slowly, as if it was a dream. Ultimately, after what felt like an hour of me struggling internally to do or say something or anything, I guess some of the other kids saw what was happening and they ran top speed toward the bus, waving their hands all crazy, and the driver, I guess, stopped and eventually realized there was a little baby that had been left unsupervised crossing the street. I only lost the ability to move appreciably or talk for about a minute, but the knowledge that my silence could be the difference for a little girl's life was incredibly disturbing for a kid in middle school to handle. It bothered me all day at school. Later, the police came and asked questions, I guess because the parents were absent or unknowing in all of this. Scary day. I'll never forget it.